All right, perfect. Okay, everybody, thank you all for joining. My name is Lynn Sweezy. I am the secretary of the board for the Hiking Buddies nonprofit side of things. We have a 501c3 now, if folks weren't aware. So, Julie, could I ask you to just admit the waiting room from here, if you don't mind?
Sure
And
can.
so, thanks a lot. We have a great team here. So again, thanks everybody for joining. We have today a very special guest, Mike McLaughlin, who is one of the co-hosts of the Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast, who I know a lot of us listen to pretty regularly. And we are here tonight to discuss the 2023 media reported search and rescue events in and around the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So if you have questions or you'd like to get in touch or learn more about Hiking Buddies, you can go to hikingbuddies.org. You can learn about the programs that we're running through Redline Guiding, and you can also view these recordings and some of the ones we've had in the past. So hikingbuddies.org, and let's see. So again, we have Mike McLaughlin with us tonight. Mike is himself a data nerd. He's a podcast host, and he's a dad joke comedian. So without further ado, please welcome Mike with a dad joke to open us up.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. So this dad joke I'm going to start off with, it's a bit of a niche dad joke. So I'm a girl dad, so I have 3 daughters. So this may go over some people's heads, but for me, it resonates. So why didn't the vampire attack Taylor Swift? Because she had bad blood. So if you're a Swiftie, that's a dad joke for you. So.
Oh my goodness, good one.
Okay. So thank you for having me. I also just want to give a shout out to Virgin because I'm rocking some Virgin gear myself. I haven't got the Hiking Buddy stuff yet, but I will definitely try to get to that. So thanks again for coming to listen to this. I did a similar presentation on the podcast. I forget what episode. I think it was like episode 123. It was the episode where we had the Civil Air Patrol in for the second time, I believe. So Jack Daly was on that show. So let me just share my screen here. Can everybody see my my screen? Awesome. All right. And then I know that Lynn had said to put questions into the chat, but I really don't care if you want to interrupt me when I'm talking and ask a question. If something pops into your head, like feel free to do so. Just come off mute and ask the question. So, but just to start off with, so the presentation that I put together is it's like a version 2 of a presentation that I did last year that we covered on the podcast. And essentially what I've been doing for like the last 4 or 5 years is collecting all of the media reported search and rescue events that have happened in the White Mountains. So New Hampshire Fish and Game does put out a press release for many of the search and rescue events that happen throughout New Hampshire. So what I've done is basically put them all on a table with certain data that, the trail, the mountain, the date, the age of the person, their sex, and then I've got some other data that I put together there. So you can actually, I'll share this with Lynn and ask her to link this out into the Hiking Buddies Facebook group in case anybody wants to check out the raw data. There is a link here to access the raw data. I did remove the names from the people that are involved in the rescue just for privacy, but otherwise it's basically the data that I'm going to cover in raw form. And then there's also a YouTube video out there from the podcast where I talk about some of this stuff, but this is kind of an updated version. I added some new slides. And just give me one sec here. Just before I get into a little bit of background about me, I do want to put a disclaimer that I'm not part of search and rescue. So I live in Massachusetts. I don't go out on search and rescues. I have an interest in search and rescue. I have a lot of friends that are involved in search and rescue, obviously through the podcast. Spoken a lot about search and rescue. So, I'm not associated with any SAR groups or anything like that. This is simply publicly available information and data that I put together to analyze. So, I'm sure that there's, some information that I'm going to miss here, but I think that overall the media reports do give a good view of what's going on in search and rescue overall within New Hampshire. So just to start out with a little bit about me, fun fact is I like to hike. So I know that's not a surprise, and I am a co-host of the Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast with my co-host Stomp. We've been doing it for about 2.5 years. My hiking experience, I look at my hiking experience sort of like a progression through college all the way to a PhD. So I look at my undergrad as my 4,000 footers that I completed. Grad school is 52 with a view. I also look at the 52 with a view as sort of like a love story with New Hampshire. Is you get to know New Hampshire through the 4,000 footers, but you get to love New Hampshire through the 52 with a view, because really what the 52 with a view does is it gets you into some of the lesser known corners, and it also sends you out away from sort of the main part of the White Mountains, and you really get to know the entire lay of the land. And then I look at the PhD program as a terrifying 25, and then my postdoctorate research has been hiking the winter 48. So I've got 47 of the 48 complete. So I'll finish that in the next, couple of weeks when I get around to it. In addition to that, I've hiked, it's in some different parts of the world. I've been out to Yosemite, I've been to Iceland, I've been out in Arizona, I've hiked in Washington and Oregon. And as we go through the presentation, some of the background photos that are on the slides will be pictures of areas that I've hiked throughout the world, as well as in the whites. And I'll try to call out the locations of the pictures as I remember them. Some of them I may not remember, but you'll see in most of the slides, I've got them sort of dimmed down on the opacity, but overall, there'll be some good pictures there. A couple of things I wanted to share around hidden gems. I've talked about these on the podcast before, but if you're a hiker and you're looking for hidden gems in areas that you can go to that are less crowded, but also provide with really cool experience, there's a couple of recommendations that I would make. Number one is Burnt Meadow Mountain, which is in Brownfield, Maine. This is my home mountain, and Burnt Meadow I recommend strongly to people because it's a sort of a beginner to moderate hike. Typically you can get up and down from the summit. I think it's about 4 miles back and forth, and there's a fair amount of elevation, but it's an amazing mountain that offers you a little bit of everything. It's got, a little bit of navigation challenges. It's not so easy to always stay on trail. It also has some good rock scrambles. It even has about a 400-foot rock slide that you can bushwhack up the back of, and then it's got another peak stone mountain that you can hop over to. It's got views out to the White Mountains on the backside. So for me, if you're looking for a hidden gem and you want to go to a place that doesn't have crazy crowds, sometimes on the weekends Burnt Meadow can get busy, but overall it's a great place to check out. I also recommend Caribou Mountain, which is actually in Maine, but it's in Evans Notch. And that's a place you can go that never has crowds. And it's got a lot of open ledges that you can hike through. And usually, I've done it, I think, twice, and I've never seen another person out there. So highly recommend that. Recently, I've also gone out to Mount Stanton to Mount Parker. So we did a little bit of a traverse. I think that area there is a hidden gem. And I like to think back, I imagine when we did that hike that Darby Field had taken that route to scope out the presidentials when he had first hiked out to Mount Washington in the 1600s. And I think that, I kind of like the idea that I was following in his footpaths. We don't know for sure if he came that way, but it's pretty likely that he did come up that side. Another hidden gem that I recommend is Redstone Quarry, which is in North Conway, New Hampshire. So if you haven't been there, it's a short day hike. You park behind Walmart and you can go out there and check out the history of the quarry. And there's a lot of cool things to look at there. And it's family friendly. There's, if you have a little kid that doesn't want to go up mountains, then Redstone Quarry is great. I also recommend checking out Cornish, Maine. They've got a bunch of good restaurants there. Krista's, Bay Haven, the Fairgrounds. Great little area in Maine. And then I also recommend checking out the Freiburg Fairgrounds on Sunday for their flea markets. I've actually picked up some cool books and maps for the White Mountains over there, so it's worth checking out. And lastly, my socials, if you want to follow me, Slasher Podcast on Instagram, or you can check out my follow my personal Instagram. I'm also on Strava. And then just a quick plug on the Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast. If you listen to it and you're on Apple, if you want to give us a 5-star review, that would be great. And then lastly, because I wanted to do an actual fun fact that it doesn't relate to hiking, I have this little picture up here in the corner. And what this is this is a photo from 2014. And if you're trying to figure out what it is, it's a man with a sword knighting another person. And then this guy right here in the brown shirt is me. The guy in the black T-shirt is a gentleman by the name of George R.R. Martin, who is the writer of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire series. This picture was from 2014, and we had gone to Kelly's Roast Beef in Revere. This was at the Boston Science Fiction Convention from 2014 I think it was at the Boston Marriott. And we spent the evening with George and his wife doing trivia, and then we went out to Kelly's Roast Beef to get him roast beef sandwiches, and he was kind enough to knight all of us knights of the roast beef sandwich. So I've been knighted by George R.R. Martin, the writer of Game of Thrones. And that evening when we sat down, we had a long discussion about what a movie would look like if Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire ever got to become a movie. And lo and behold, you fast forward 10 years later and it became one of the most popular series in the world. So I think that's a pretty cool fun fact, is that I got to know George a little bit and his wife Paris and hang out with him. So I can only see Lynn, but she seems impressed with that. So I'll go with it.
That's pretty awesome, Mike. I don't know if you're like waiting for your co-host, after that.
I know. It's like kind of like I need someone to vibe off of. But anyway, just to start off with, so we're going to get into the data a little bit. But I just want to start off with your odds of needing a rescue in New Hampshire. And I'll get into how I got this number. But in the year 2020, the Forest Service estimated that there was about 2.8 million hikers that entered the White Mountains that year, and there was a total of 110 people that made it into media-reported search and rescue events. So that's about 1 in 25,000 hikers. So I immediately went to ChatGPT and I said, can you give me some examples of things where the odds are 1 in 25,000? So they came back with like a small prize in a lottery, being struck by lightning, dying from accidental drowning in the U.S. in a given year, being killed by a falling coconut, which I feel like that's like only if you live in Hawaii. So I don't know if the odds on that. An allergic reaction to penicillin. And then this one here, I think Stomp has had this happen to him, being injured by a toilet in the U.S. in a given year, e.g. falling into a toilet or being bitten by a snake. So the point is that the odds of you being involved in a search and rescue event are very slim. So I think it's helpful to keep that in mind, that, we all hear these horror stories. We all see people out on trail where we feel like, oh, wow, they're really not prepared. The reality is that the chance of those people getting in trouble is pretty slim. Okay. Next, I just want to get to the headlines here. So when I sit in these long presentations, a lot of people, they wait till the very end to say like, all right, here's the conclusions, blah, blah, blah. I'm giving you the conclusions ahead of time here. So based on what I see, originally I thought like, okay, I can track this data and it's going to give me answers. It's going to give me patterns where I could potentially say like, okay, now there's ways to like lower the amount of search and rescue events. And I think there's some things that you can do to potentially lower it, but really we'll dig into the numbers a little bit. And I think when you look at the numbers, you'll realize that there's actually not a super high volume of search and rescue. And we're actually kind of heading in the right direction when it comes to the volume that we see. But there's no super secret patterns. Again, search and rescue calls are relatively rare in relation to the volume of hikers. The most common types of injuries are lower leg injuries, navigation, and the lack of headlamp as well. Young people do tend to be slightly more likely to be involved in search and rescue calls, and then men are involved in fatalities at a much higher rate than women. My takeaways from looking at all this data and the actions that you can actually take that this data sort of points to is, number one, adding a splint and a wrap to your 10 essentials. Because of the volume of lower leg injuries, having a splint and a wrap with you and knowing how to use that. Not all the lower leg injuries are going to be cases where somebody can self-rescue for various reasons. If you get a clean break, or if you have a situation where somebody's really severely torn tendons or things like that, they're not going to be able to get out no matter what. But there are cases where people have been injured and they've needed a litter rescue, or they've been walked out, where a splint and a wrap, maybe you're not using it for yourself, but you happen to come upon somebody that needs help. I do recommend that everybody carry a splint and a wrap as part of your 10 essentials year round, because just the volume of lower leg injuries it kind of screams to just being common sense. The next thing I recommend is to carry an extra headlamp. And I think the Hiking Buddies has been great about this, handing out headlamps and things like that. And I always carry 2 headlamps. I have like my expensive Black Diamond one, and then I have the Hiking Buddies one, and I've usually carried like Walmart Energizer headlamps as well. And the idea is that if you run into somebody that might be on trouble on trail, you can give them the headlamp, and it's going to be no loss for you. It's what is it, $10, $20 headlamp. You can give it to them and they'll be okay. It also covers you in case your primary headlamp goes out. You've got a backup. So I think that's another one where I would say, always carry 2 headlamps at all times. And also, I think you want to keep in mind that we're all in this together, and a lot of the stuff that I say you should carry, don't assume it's for you. Assume that you may need to use that for other people and bail them out. I think the other thing that's pretty common in the data, it's a 3-hour minimum wait time before the rescue team arrives. So in the news reports, they'll list the time that the call was received, and then they generally list the time that the rescue team was able to get to the victim to even start a rescue. And at minimum, it's 3 hours. In a lot of cases, it's more like 4 or 5 hours. So you've got to have enough gear with you to make sure that you can comfortably sit in one place for 3+ hours to get a rescue. Once winter and cold weather comes into play, the other thing that's critical is to make sure that you have ground insulation. I also recommend hot liquid, and then a minimum of a bivy. Once the weather gets even lower, you want to make sure that you bring a heavier sleeping bag with you. I recommend that the ground insulation, the hot liquid, or a way to make hot liquid, as well as a bivy/sleeping bag, is also added to your 10 essentials when you're in winter hiking situations. It's even more critical because if you do get injured and you're going to be immobile, typically you're going to need to be able to wait it out for a rescue, and you may need as much as 12 hours of being comfortable in cold weather. And if you're going to go directly on the ground with no ground insulation, you're going to get cold and wet immediately, and hypothermia is going to kick in quickly. The hot liquid's critical because it's the fastest way for you to help somebody that's experiencing hypothermia. So I typically will carry a thermos of hot chocolate. It's a little heavier, but if you run into somebody that's experiencing hypothermia on the trail, it'll be an immediate solution for them, so that you can get them, warmed up inside and then get them more clothes on. If you have to rely on just using like extra clothes or a sleeping bag, it's going to take a lot more time. So the hot liquid's critical. And then I also recommend to people that you got to operate with a mountain will be there another day mindset. I know the people on this call, I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it is important for us to sort of give that perspective to new hikers or people that may not be experienced, that, you've got to have that inner voice inside your head that says like, all right, I'm going to turn it around. I'm not feeling it. The mountain will be there another day. And I know it's tough to do that, especially when you've got goal-driven people that are looking to accomplish something and they don't want to get back in the car and feel like they're a failure for not summiting. But you've got to operate with that mindset. And then the last thing I say is don't be shy to strike up a conversation with other hikers, but just pick your topics carefully. If you feel like somebody is potentially out there and they're in over their head, don't come right out and say it. Strike up a general conversation with them and try to sort of understand where they're at. You can do it in a friendly way. And then you also have to be careful of sort of safety dynamics. Some people will be more attuned or concerned about any questions around where are you going, where have you come from, who are you with. So just be careful about any of those types of topics. But, don't be shy about striking up a conversation. You never know, you might run into a situation where somebody actually does need help, or hey, I don't have a headlamp, and yeah, it's 6 o'clock and it's getting late and I've got another 3 hours. Here you go, have my headlamp. Um, One thing that I think is pretty common is like, oh, do you have a light? Yeah, I have a light. They're saying they have a light from their cell phone. You want to pry a little bit and say it's more than just your cell phone, right? And you might find out that they don't have anything other than their cell phone. So give them that hiking buddy's headlamp or whatever the extra headlamp is. So anyway, that's the conclusion. If you want to drop off now, that's cool, but I'm going to give you more fun stuff to talk about.
Hey,
The
Mike.
first, yeah, go ahead.
Mike, this is Julie. You said I could interrupt at any time, so I'm gladly going to do so.
Sure.
In your key takeaways, they're great and everything. I just wanted to mention, in using your gear, like if you're carrying a splint and stuff, people don't realize how important it is to actually know how to use that gear, right? So it's like practice, the gear that you're actually carrying, you're not carrying it for nothing. Like there is some practice involved. Like it would be helpful to, to quickly learn how to use it so you can, execute it, in a quick manner while you're out there. Secondly, taking care of yourself first if you're with a group. And this I learned very quickly, making sure that you're safe and that you're okay before you start treating or helping another hiker is really important. Just making sure that you're okay. And then the third comment I have, it's actually a question. Why do you think men are more apt to be in danger opposed to women?
Well, I think that the breakdown on sex from search and rescue events is pretty equal. The fatalities are significantly skewed towards men, and I think that I don't know. I feel like probably there's a fair amount of medical issues that happen with men that maybe I think anybody that's in their 50s or above, if they're a man, they should be much more proactive around getting, like their carotid artery scans and things like that. I don't know, maybe men are like more apt to kind of blow off the standard medical assessments, and a lot of 50-something, 60-something men have medical issues when they're on trail, or maybe I think men sometimes also sort of have that mentality that, I was an athlete, therefore their brain thinks that they can push harder than their body's capable of, and there's injuries. And then there's a factor of some young people that do some reckless behavior, and young men tend to be more apt to do that than young women.
Of the male numbers, is it skewed more towards the older people with medical conditions or the younger people doing stupid stuff?
It's more skewed towards the 50, 60-something year old folks that I think are having medical issues, Mike.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, and I have a slide that covers that later on too. Great. Yeah. And everybody else has questions, feel free to hop in. But just to give a little bit of background. So one of the big questions I always had is I was like, it's great to know how many search and rescue events there are, but it would be even better to know how that compares to the total volume of hikers. So one of the nice things is that there is data that the U.S. Forest Service provides. So they run this program called the Forest Service National Visitor User Monitoring Program, and essentially this is an estimate of visitors to the White Mountains. So every 5 years they go to different places within the White Mountains, and they do survey information. And from those surveys and polling, they can estimate the total volume of visits. So they do it every 5 years, and they spread it out the number of dates that they'll visit, and from there they can estimate the total number of visitors. Through those surveys, they also ask people what activities they're involved in. So this is a 20-year view of the last 4 visitor use monitoring program surveys for the White Mountains. So you can see that everybody says like, oh, it's getting so much busier up in New Hampshire, and they're right. The visitors have almost doubled in the last 15, 20 years, and then the volume of hikers has tripled. And there's some interesting data there. You can see that in 2005, the volume of men to women was significantly higher. That's almost evened out. And then you can see that there is an increase in underrepresented population. At the same time, there's also income data that they collect. And I think from 2005 to 2010, I used $75,000 or above as high income, and then from 2015 to 2020, I used 100,000. So you can see the percentage of higher income people has increased. And overall, even in 2020, where we had COVID, we still saw 4 million visitors, and then the estimate is that about 70% of those were hikers. So you've got 2.8 million hikers. So that's how I got that number in that first slide that essentially said, of the 110 people that had involved in rescues out of 2.8 million hikers. So, that's just to give people a perspective on how many people are visiting. So if you have people asking like, oh man, it's gotten so much busier over the last 20 years, like, yeah, you're right. It's actually visitors have doubled and hikers have tripled. And my guess is that in 2025, my guess is total visitors is going to probably be up closer to 5 million and total hikers will be well over 3 million, because with COVID, I think that the numbers were a little bit down. And you can check out the website here. It's linked in the presentation. So if you want to go into the presentation, you can double click. You can actually look, and they have all kinds of these visitor use monitoring surveys in different parts of the world or different parts of the US. Just a little bit about sort of validating my numbers is I was able to find an update from New Hampshire Fish and Game that provided the volume of search and rescue events from 2009 to 2019. And Fish and Game had conducted a total of about 1,900 reportable search and rescue missions at a cost of $3.1 million. They did specify that 62% of those were hikers and climbers, so that equates to about 1,200 total missions. So if you divide that out over about 10 years, you'll see around 120 search and rescue missions. And then when you compare the averages for what I saw from 2019 to 2022, it seems like they're pretty close. I've often heard that SAR numbers are going up. And I think the volume of visitors compared to the search and rescue numbers would indicate that actually overall, based on the number of hikers, search and rescue missions are actually going down. But they're pretty steady overall, like year over year. It's about the same number that comes up. But also keep in mind that we've got more hikers the last 10, 15 years. I also think that there's a misconstrued idea that the cost of missions is associated with the volume of missions. Like 1 or 2 big missions that involve like 2 or 3 days worth of helicopter searches, if you have 3 or 4 of those in a year, that could blow through a significant amount of the budget. So oftentimes you'll hear that the budget is being stressed, and people assume that that just means that actual number of missions are busier than they may be. So there are 2 different factors here. There's the overall cost, and then there's the volume. And the cost can be dictated by a big mission, or a big search can really blow through the budget. And then also keep in mind that Fish and Game has stated that in recent years they've seen an increase in cases where people are calling them panicked and they need to guide them out over the phone. I've never talked to anybody in Fish and Game about this, but I do know with new technology, they are able to ascertain people's GPS coordinates. So my theory is that in some cases where before they might have gone out and actually rescued somebody overnight in nice weather, they may be on the phone with someone to say like, look, we know where you are. You're in a safe place. You don't have a light. Sit still for the next 6 or 7 hours. And then when the light comes up, here's how you're going to get out. And I think those cases don't make the news. So when Fish and Game talks about volume, what I'm giving you tonight is just a piece of what they actually do, because they've got this whole bucket of search and rescues that don't make the news. There's also Mount Monadnock. Ton of rescues go on there that are just handled by the state park and never make the news. The Belknaps, a lot of those rescues, I think, Lakes region, I'm sure helps out on those. And I don't know if Kim's here. She might be able to give more insight on this, but I suspect that in the Belknaps and some of those lower regions, a lot of the search and rescue events are handled by local fire departments and police and may never make the news either. So just keep that in mind, is that there's a whole world of snowmobiles and ATVs and elderly walk-offs and a whole bunch of other things that go on that aren't related to hiking that Fish and Game does. So it's a crazy busy operation.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
It's Mike M.
Hey, Mike.
I was just gonna say you're right about that. Like the Alton Fire Department handles a lot of the stuff on Mount Major.
Yep.
But they do have us come in and help once in a while. So.
Yeah. So there's you could probably assume that like there's twice the volume of activities compared to what hits the media a lot of times. And this is just some notes about the data. So again, this is based on news reports, doesn't include the ATV, snowmobile, hunting, elderly searches. All the data is from news reports. Sometimes I can't get an age of somebody or a resident and things like that. If sometimes I'll do some digging to see if I can get an age just on an internet search. The sex is based on pronoun use in media reports. And then, like I said, this data is not representative of the total amount of rescue operations. But I think the way that you can look at this is that it's 5 years of consistent data. So it's sort of like polling information is that, once you know over time, like a particular political district, what the political makeup is on it, you can pretty much estimate based on polling data. So this is sort of the same thing is that you can estimate what the total volume is based on what hits the news reports. And then lastly, I do have a rating which I call negligent, not negligent. I used to call it shame, no shame, because I was a little bit too judgmental in the early days when I started looking into this stuff, but I've now call it negligent, not negligent. It's a subjective opinion based on personal assessment, but it also, I do take some of the information that's written in the press releases. Oftentimes, you'll get a vibe from the CO that writes up the news report on whether or not they feel like the person was negligent. Typically, if they don't have a headlamp, I'll rate that as negligent. If they're cited as being unprepared or there's a fine assessed, I'll typically rate that as negligent. Any situation where there's a minor involved, I automatically just call that not negligent. So it's subjective. So just keep that in mind when we get into that piece of it. And just to call out the photo behind here, I believe is, actually, I can't remember where that photo is. So we'll go on to the next one. The background photo on this particular one was from 3 or 4 weeks ago from Mount Madison looking out to Mount Washington in an undercast. So this was like a spectacular day. And there's a couple of other photos I think I included on this day. But this is the summary. So you can see a SAR event is one individual event where the press release puts out that the rescue team had to come out and save a person or a group. And then the total people rescued is the volume. So you can see essentially like the SAR events are lower than the total people rescued because you'll have situations where there'll be like 5 or 6 people that are together that needed a rescue. So that's why you get the differences in these. So typically, if you see a big deviance between the events and the rescued people, that means there was probably a couple of cases where big groups had to be rescued. And I'll talk about that in a little while as well. But you can see it's pretty steady. A little bit of a drop off in 2023, which is nice to see. So if we keep assuming that the number of visitors keeps going up and the media reported search and rescue events are going down a little bit, then I think that, again, I go back to my original slide that says, the odds of people being involved in a rescue are very slim. Okay. Next up is the hotspots. So when you look at this, you can see, so this is a total of 5 years worth of data. Anything that touches Falling Waters, Old Bridle, anything along the Little Haystack, Lafayette, Lincoln, I just call that Franconia Ridge. So obviously Franconia Ridge, Mount Washington, Mount Chicora, and Monadnock are the 4 big ones. And then you can see Cannon, Wells Sticky, Mount Major, the Moat Mountains, Moosilauke, and Garfield. And I believe if you look at the Trailhead Steward program, I believe they have all of these areas covered pretty well. I don't know about Cannon, but the rest of them, I know Wells Sticky, Chicora, Mount Washington, Franconia Ridge, they have those pretty well covered. So that's a good sign, is hopefully Trailhead Stewards are steering some people away. Overall, this represents about a little over half of the search and rescue calls. So you can generally look at these 10 or so mountains and regions and say that they're the bulk of the search and rescues. Every other mountain is pretty much like onesies and twosies over the course of a year, or just a handful. I took a look for the 4,000 footers. I think Wambach, Middle Carter, in Mount Tom, maybe, or one of those Willie Tom fields. Those are 4,000 footers that I don't think that there's been a rescue call on, that I've seen in the last 5 years. But I think all the other 4,000 footers have had at least one. And then the age-old question, who needs rescues more, Massachusetts or New Hampshire? I think the answer here is Massachusetts. I theorize that given the volume of hikers, I feel like there's probably more hikers from Massachusetts than New Hampshire overall. Of those 2.8 million, I feel like there's probably more Massachusetts people. So I think that, maybe it's proportional as far as the rescues, but it's obviously it's fair to say that Massachusetts people are more likely to be in a rescue than New Hampshire people. So if you're a local New Hampshireite and you want your badge, then that's fine. And then you can see Maine and New York, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Connecticut's got a smaller volume. They're horrible drivers though, so they've got to deal with that. So they seem to be safer hikers than us. All right, so just a few noteworthy cases and trends that I wanted to call up before we get into the data itself. One trend that I've noticed is that there are young people in groups that tend to get in trouble, and you'll see like a pretty consistent pattern over the last 4 or 5 years. And I call these out like there was a group of 5 Canadian hikers that were hiking in April. I think that they thought the weather was going to be a little bit better than it was. They experienced winter-like conditions. None of them were prepared for it. They were going hypothermic. Rescue team had to go out and save them. I don't think that they had lights or anything like that. The opposite happened in June of 2020, where there was 3 Michigan youths that were unprepared for the heat. They didn't bring any water with them, and they got in trouble and needed a rescue. Another common theme that we see is that, you'll get groups of grad students that want to go out and do some hiking. There was 2 cases in 2020, one in October. 5 Cambridge, Mass grad students were on a backpacking trip, and they got in a little over their head on the Black Angel Trail, which is right by Carter Dome. Well, not right by, but it's in the area of Carter, Hot and Carter Dome. So they had to get pulled out. They were wet and cold. And then in January, there was 7 grad students that got lost on the Bowles Trail. So they took a wrong turn on Mount Chicora. Group of UMass students that were lost on the Crawford Ridgepole. So they were doing Morgan Percival. They ended up down by Doublehead and off trail, had to get rescued. And then there was 3 Rhode Island hikers that started up Mount Avalon at 6 o'clock with no light. This happened to be the same day of the fatality that happened in 2020, the same day or the same weekend that the Mount Washington road race. There was a gentleman that unfortunately passed away near Mount Clay. So at the same time that was going on, these 3 hikers were hiking on Avalon with no lights. And then 4 New York teenagers missed a turn down Greenleaf. Somewhat of a common situation, ended up in Garfield Pond. So you don't want to interrogate people, but when you do see these larger groups of young people, that might be worth keeping in mind to say, like, that's a more comfortable situation. We can say like, oh, where you guys been? Where are you going? Maybe pry a little bit, make sure they know what they're doing. I know I was coming down Daniel Webster Scout Trail one day, like 2 years ago, and I ran into a group of like 5 or 6 guys that were young people, and they were asking me how close they were to Appalachia. They were heading back there, and I kind of laughed, and I said, I was like, well, you got a ways to go. You got to go back over the mountain. So they had gone the wrong way down Madison and got lost. So I sent them on their way, but it's worth having a conversation with these young folks if you think that they may be in a tight spot. The other thing is, if you talk to people on search and rescue, they will tell you that they get a nose for this stuff. Like they'll know, like, okay, today's probably going to be a day where we're going to get a lot of call outs. There are periods where they'll just like something's in the air and there'll be like 3-4 call outs over the course of a day. They usually tend to cluster in the same area as well. So I'm sure that there's some people on search and rescue here that can confirm that. But I called out a couple of these clusters. One is, in August of 2023, there were 4 separate rescues in and around Mount Washington. There was one on Mount Willard. There was an older gentleman that got lost around Lost Pond. And then at the same time, there was a rescue that involved the AMC Hut crew on Ammonoosuc, and then another rescue on the Tuckerman Ravine Trail. And then you had on June 18th, 2022, you had 3 rescues going on. This was the day that I had talked about where there was the fatality. So I think it was rough weather coming in. So you had Avalon, the fatality on Clay, and then Mount Hayes. And then there's been a few other days where there's been clusters of rescues. August 21st, 2022 was an interesting one because you had a rescue on Falling Waters. Then you had 2 separate elderly hikers, one that was on the Great Gulf that was in trouble. I think there was a 70-something-year-old guy, and then there was another guy on the Gulf Side Trail that I think was in his 80s that got in trouble. So it was very weird. There was 2 elderly hikers that day that got in trouble. So search and rescue teams will tell you, sometimes they can, if the weather is a little too nice or a little too bad for the season, people tend to get in trouble, and then they typically can kind of feel it when a rescue is going to cluster. So, but I thought those were interesting. And a couple of noteworthy cases I called out with Reckless. Now, speaking of Reckless, this picture in the background here, this is from a winter hike that I did a couple of years ago up Israel Ridge, and the snow was crazy. If you want to do a reckless hike, Israel Ridge in the winter on a Saturday, expecting that you're going to get there on time to get a spot in Gray Knob, that's reckless, because we got there and it was full of hikers and there was no chance. So we ended up just bailing out and going back down to Appalachia because, we didn't want to sleep in Crag Camp. We were too wiped out. But Israel Ridge is a reckless hike if you're interested. But anyway, the couple of things that I called out here is there was 2 hikers that were lost near the Watcher. Those 2 young men went wandering off and actually I think they got fined and charged with reckless behavior. There was another case of a grandson and a grandfather on Lion's Head where they just bit off more than they could chew. And I think the grandson had to go and get a rescue initiated for his grandfather. So another one that stands out is there was don't ever do this. The snow bridge collapse on Tuckerman was a couple of years ago. A young man, I think, stood under the snow bridge and it collapsed on him. There was another case of a hiker that was, I think, right below Mount Washington, and he called for a rescue and decided so he was on Crawford Path, called for rescue. They initiated a rescue for the guy. They were looking for him, trying to figure out where he was, thought he might have been at Lakes of the Cloud. He ended up just going back down Ammonoosuc, never answered rescuers' calls and never called them back. So they were out there looking for him for a while before they finally figured out that he had made it down. And then lastly, there was a rescue this year of a gentleman that drove up to Mount Washington, decided to hike down to Tuckerman, the Tuckerman Ravine Trail, to meet some of his family that was coming up. And I think he was not even a half a mile from the summit and had to call for a rescue because he got panicked and didn't have any gear with him. So just a couple of examples of some of the reckless behavior that does go on. And the vast majority of rescue calls are just people that, have gotten hit by dumb luck, but there are cases where people run into issues. So any questions on any of this stuff before I go into the data? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So this is just a quick view of the search and rescue averages by month. So you can see May to October is the busy period for search and rescue. So typically August is the busiest. There's been months where this is the averages, but there's months where things have spiked, and I have a slide for that afterwards. But this picture here in the background is, I believe, from the summit of Mount Tecumseh. I got a little undercast there. I've been really lucky with undercast over the years. I don't know if other people have, but I do tend to usually hike a couple times a year where I get these fantastic undercasts. So that was one day on Tecumseh. That was pretty good. This is a monthly breakdown by year here. So this shows you, I showed you the averages previously. This shows how spiky it can be. So you can see May of 2019 was super busy. June is usually pretty steady. You can see May of 2020, that's when COVID hit. It was pretty slow. August has had a couple of slow years, and it's had a couple of busy years. Especially, I think this was the busiest month of all time, was the 23 people involved in rescues in 2022. And then October tends to ebb and flow. And then September, we had one spiky year. So yeah, 2022 was kind of slow until August and September kicked in, and it got a little crazy. So, and then the picture in the background of this is in Iceland for people that are interested. So this is from a mountain called Hafnarfjall, which is north of Reykjavik. It's a outside of a small town called Borganes, and it's simply like you just pull up to this farm and you just walk over. They have like a little ladder that gets you over the fence where the sheep stay in, and then you just get on this trail. And I was literally, the only people that were in this view was me and like about 1,000 sheep. And you just go right up. There's really not any trails. It's just like herd paths that you just hike up until you get to the top. So it's very cool. Next up is search and rescue by category. So this is where I sort of look at each event and I categorize it by what the situation was. So you can see here lower leg injuries are typically pretty steady. We had a big spike in 2022. You do see a fair amount of lost people. So this is either they didn't have a headlamp, they panicked because they lost a trail, or they just didn't know how to navigate. And you can see that lower leg injuries in 2020 spiked up quite a bit. Well, the sort of headlamp issues lowered a little bit. And my theory is that, like I said earlier, I think that now that search and rescue calls are coming in and they can get better GPS coordinates, my theory is that over the summertime, if they have those calls, they're not initiating a search and rescue anymore. They're just telling people to sit tight. So I think the lack of headlamp situation, maybe they're not hitting the media as much because people are just staying overnight and then getting out in the morning. Other things like head, shoulder. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Question, what do you make in that graph that you were just talking about where there's 11 in 2022? What do you make of that number then doubling in the next year?
Well, I think it normalized, because if you look at the last couple of years before that, it was pretty steady. And I think that my recollection is that the GPS system came into place sometime in 2021, maybe early 2022. So I think that maybe some of those headlamp situations just came in colder weather or worse weather. So they had to get out there and find people without having them wait it out.
Okay, thanks. I actually have one question in the chat if you want to answer it.
Sure.
Maybe it's better cell phones too.
Yeah, true. That's true too.
Yeah, it's a good point, Mike. I have a question from Kathy. She asks, Mike, what is your opinion about the names of those rescued being published?
I think I could take it or leave it. I think as a general policy with the podcast, we don't provide people's names. Sometimes we'll slip up, but we typically just say, 24-year-old female, 25-year-old man. I think that that's fine if they wanted to go to that policy. I don't need to know the names, really. I think the only noteworthy thing about the names is that I have picked off that there was one person that had been involved in 2 search and rescues, which I thought was interesting. Is that, okay, well, this is the same person, same location, same age, and they had been involved in 2 search and rescues over the course of 3 years. So that's the one thing I'd say it's kind of nice to have the name to sniff that out, but otherwise I could take it or leave it. And it does make me wonder, like anything that discourages people from calling, I would think that, you want to limit, if people are nervous about getting their name in the news, then maybe they won't call when they should. Maybe it's worth thinking about.
That's my concern.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Is like, oh, it's like you have a concern about like the cost of the ambulance and the medical piece of it, but also like, oh man, I don't want to get them. I know for me, that would be my train of thought. Like if I got in trouble, I'd be like, there's no way I want my name in the paper. I would be like, I would give them Stomp's legal name and tell them that that's who I was. But I would definitely hesitate to call because I'm afraid my name gets in the paper. So.
Exactly.
Yep. And then you can see reckless behavior. These are subjective ratings, so I think I've gotten much more charitable as far as reckless behavior goes and rating it that way. I think I've softened my stance quite a bit over the last 5 or 6 years just because I've gotten to know more search and rescue people. I've gotten to talk to people that have like a wider knowledge around these topics, and I've gotten much more charitable, I think. So I'm less likely to, I was a hard grader before, I'm an easy grader now. So you'll see that I think part of the reckless behavior, those have moved into the miscellaneous head, shoulder, and other category because I'm just being nicer. So, and then medical issues have been pretty steady, and then fatigue. I could probably put this into like the sort of miscellaneous, but I think fatigue, typically I'll reserve that for cases where people will say like, I've got, I'm not prepared, I don't have enough water, or, somebody's refusing to move, and then they later are able to like hike themselves down, but they just needed a rescue. So I'll typically call those fatigue. But you can see here, like lower leg injury is the big one. And I think, not all of these lower leg injuries are going to be solved by a splint, but maybe 25, 30% of them could be, and that's like 10 or 15 less rescues that have to be done in a year. So, and then same with the headlamp. Maybe you're not going to solve all of them, but maybe you solve 3 or 4 of them by having an extra headlamp. Okay, moving on here. So this is age range and sex. So you can see that there's a couple of things here. So it's pretty even when you look at this. Like young people are about twice as likely to get into issues as like 30-somethings. But then you can see it's pretty even. The women tend to get in a little bit more trouble in their 40s and 50s. And then the men, my theory here is that a lot of men, like they don't realize that they can't physically do what they used to do. So they get in over their head a little bit, and you see that continues well into their 70s. So the whole idea of stubborn old men, I think, holds true here sometimes. So, and again, some of these are just slip and falls and things that you can't control, but I also think that there's something there. That's a noteworthy difference. Yeah, and I think that the 0 to 19, like there's some 18-year-olds here, but there's a fair amount of kids that are just getting dragged along by their parents and get themselves involved. And just to call it, the background photo here is a burnt forest from the Columbia River Gorge. So I hiked out in Multnomah Falls, and if you go up into the falls, it's this iconic falls in Oregon, Columbia River Gorge. If you hike off the backside of that, there's a ton of like beautiful forest and smaller waterfalls, and then they had a forest fire back there. So there's a burnt forest back there that is absolutely enchanting. So this is a photo of the burnt forest that I took that I thought was pretty nice. So threw it in there. And then this next one here is, again, this is the negligence rating. And again, I've become more and more of an easy scorer on this, but still you can sort of see the negligence versus no negligence. So again, negligence typically is either the news report called out that they weren't prepared, or they didn't have a headlamp or navigation ability, or they were clearly doing something reckless. So you can see the 20-somethings tend to be much more reckless than or negligent than everybody else. And you can see the the age breakdown here is typically you don't have, with experience comes wisdom. And also I think that people tend to, stay within their bounds. Young people tend to just be a little bit more risk accepting. So, and then the background photos for this is just a couple of views of, this is a look down into the northern Yosemite, into the, I forget, the Sierras, I think. And then this is a view of Half Dome and the cable. So I was out there a couple of months ago doing Half Dome and all that. So it's a nice area. Highly recommend it. And then this is just negligence by year. So again, you can see that I've become maybe a nicer grader here. And but you can see last year this was a 22, but it's pretty steady. I think that like 2021, 2022, 2023, I've been grading pretty consistently. I think I was more of I was a little bit more of a hard ass, I think, on 2019, 2020, but like I said, I've softened. And then this is sort of the seasonal breakdown of search and rescue. So I guess I probably should have. I don't like this slide. It's a little tough to read. But winter you got 35, fall you've got 123, spring you got 151, and then summer's the busy season. And then there's really no. Weekends obviously are a little bit busier, and then Mondays, I'm assuming there's a fair amount of Monday holidays in there, but there's no secret to any day that's safer to hike on here. And then this picture here is just a picture of in the fall from Glen Boulder when I did an overnight with my friend Tom to finish his 4,000 footer on isolation, and then we camped down below in one of those campsites below isolation. So that's a great hike. And then question comes up around search and rescue. Is it safer to be solo or is it safer to be in a group? Since 2021, I've been capturing whether or not somebody was with somebody or whether they were by themselves. So you can see, the overall rescues. It's just as likely that you're going to be in a rescue if you're involved with a group than solo. There's really no indicators. Matter of fact, you're more likely to be in a rescue with a group situation than solo. So you do hear people say like, oh, it's never safe to hike solo. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit more of a risk to get into a situation where you need a search and rescue when you're solo, but ultimately, it doesn't. It's not an indicator that you're more likely to get into a rescue situation.
I'm surprised by this because I would have thought it the other way around.
Yeah, you would think so, right? I was kind of surprised by this one too, Mike. And a lot of these are situations where it's just like two people, and I'm calling that a group, but still, just having that other person there that can either hike up to somewhere to get a call out or, can help with the situation. It's more common than you think that there's other people around.
It's just based on my recollection, I can just recall more that were involving people splitting up and things going bad, people solo and stuff like that, were especially fatalities.
Yeah, and I have some data that shows it definitely the data comes back to solo people when it comes to fatality. So I'll get to that slide in a second.
Okay.
But also just keep in mind for the group situations, when people started with a group and then they were separated and then they needed a rescue, I counted that as a group situation just because I feel like that's a failure of the group to kind of stay together and protect each other. And just the background photo for this one is, I think, from a trip that I did, again, with my friend Tom. We did a 3-night or 2-night on the AT coming from Dartmouth Skiway up to Mount Cube. So this is the north summit of Mount Cube with, again, I caught an awesome undercast in the morning coming up from Hexacube Shelter. So awesome picture. And this is so Mike,
Hey, Mike.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I have to know if you used the Penta Privy by the Hexacube Shelter.
I believe I did. Yeah, I mean, if there was a privy there, I used it, but I don't recall because it was dark when we got there. It was dark, so maybe I didn't appreciate it as much.
It's the best privy in the whites, and it has its own logbook.
Okay, I feel like I remember that because it's a tale of two cities on that hike. So when you come in from Dartmouth and you go over Mount what's the mountain before Cube that has
Smart.
the fire tower? Yeah, Smarts.
Smarts?
Smarts has the privy that's a wide open privy. So there's no like walls around it. You just go out in the open. And then the Hexacube one is like a Cadillac version. So that's an interesting hike. But the fatalities here. So Mike, you can see the group and solo dynamic. So I didn't capture the group and solo from 2019 and 2020. So I don't have info, but I suspect that it'll probably be about even between group and solo. And then you can see seasonally, it's pretty much distributed around overall search and rescue. From an age perspective, this goes back to Mike, what we were talking about around like 50 and 60-year-olds tend to have, a lot of these medical issues. And, unfortunately, it's tough to deal with those, if you're dealing with a heart issue and you're pushing yourself on a hike, it can be very dangerous, especially if you're solo and every second counts for getting people out there. And, there's a fair amount of hypothermia. There's been some young people that have passed away. Unfortunately, we did have somebody last year, a young gentleman that I don't think people really talked about as much, that 21-year-old that had died on the Osgood Trail below Madison, that, I think he had a medical issue and unfortunately passed away. So things do happen. And then you can see here the gender mix of male to female when it comes to fatalities. And I think that this is a mix of, older men are more likely to, I think, push themselves harder and get into medical issues. I think that, maybe there's more apt to take risks and they get into situations where they're facing hypothermia or some other risk in inclement weather. And then, maybe there's some young people that just are reckless. And so there's some climbing incidents in here as well mixed in. So, but yeah, it's definitely something to consider, especially when you get up into that 50 and 60-year age bracket. I recommend people just be more proactive about getting scans. There's these life scans that you can get to check your heart health and things like that people should be getting and taking seriously. So that's the data piece of it. I got a couple of other things I wanted to cover about missing people and unsolved crimes. But before I get into that, does anybody have any questions about this data?
Mike, there's one question in the chat that I'll read from Don.
Sure.
And Don asks, have you done any comparisons between New Hampshire and other regions of the Northeast, Maine, Vermont, ADK, or west of the Mississippi, Pacific Northwest, Colorado, similar breakdowns, or just number of rescues?
So the data collection around search and rescue, I know that there's like a centralized, there's a number of different states and governing bodies that have centralized databases that capture it. I haven't done a lot of work to compare other regions. I have in the past gotten some Adirondack data that I was able to compare, but I can't remember whether there was any conclusions on it. But I do think that each region is distinct and has their own challenges. Like, I don't know, I think what would be interesting is if you could get a nationwide search and rescue database going, but I don't know, like, the things that Hawaii deals with versus New Hampshire may not be as relevant, but I certainly think the Adirondacks in New Hampshire are relevant, but I haven't expanded beyond the White Mountains at this point. I have talked to some professors in different schools that do larger research, and they've been interested in the data that I've put together. And there's been some discussions with some professors around potentially partnering on research papers, but it hasn't gone anywhere. I did talk to a young lady yesterday from Syracuse that's doing a paper that she was interested in this data, and she's talking to a number of stakeholders across the Adirondacks and New Hampshire. So when she comes out with what she publishes, it may be a comparison across different locations. But for me, I'm playing in the whites. All right. So then a couple of other things I'm interested in here is there are some unresolved criminal cases and missing people in the White Mountains, and we talk about this in the podcast a fair amount. Sherry Roth is one that still I think people are still interested in. She was 22 years old. She was living in, I believe, North Conway. She went for a hike on Sawyer Brook Trail in Livermore, and she did not return at home. She was reported missing that evening by friends. Her body was discovered 3 days later, and her autopsy indicated that she'd been strangled to death. The killer has never been located, and it's a mystery. There is some discussion I've seen online about whether or not there may be some evidence that has DNA data, DNA on it. If there is, maybe they could do genetic testing to see if they could tie in suspected killers, but I don't think anything has gone to that level yet. Another case that's interesting in 1989, Pamela Webb. I believe she was a Maine resident, and she was on her way to see her boyfriend in Mason, New Hampshire, when she disappeared. Her truck was found in Maine, and there was signs of struggle. Her skeletal remains were discovered off of Route 3 in Franconia, so it sounds like, maybe she was killed somewhere else, and then the body was dumped there. But they've never been able to solve that crime, and I don't know if there's DNA evidence in that case. So it'd be interesting to see if they could ever get any movement on that. Louise Chaput is a well-known case. So Louise was a Canadian citizen who had come down to Pinkham Notch to do some hiking in and around Mount Washington. She had checked into the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center and was planning to stay over. She did a short hike. My recollection is that she went over to Lost Pond, connected somehow over to Glen Boulder, and then was murdered on the Glen Boulder side, and her body was found in a field right close to the Glen Boulder trailhead. Her backpack, she had a blue backpack with a Canadian patch on it that was never located. And, it's tough to know exactly what happened, but I'm assuming that potentially the killer might have been in the Pinkham Notch area. Maybe he followed her along that trail and then finally, picked a moment to attack her. She was stabbed to death, I believe. And then maybe made its way back to, through Lost Pond, or maybe they took the Daratissima Trail and cut over. It would be interesting to do a search in that particular area to see if maybe some evidence might have been missed. I don't know how thoroughly teams had searched the area or whether they just looked in the immediate area where they found her body and didn't look around. But it would be interesting to see if there was ever, any expanded search in that particular area. Maybe you could find her backpack. I don't know if there's DNA evidence. I know that there was a podcast in French language that covered the story, and, it would be interesting to see if they could ever solve that case. The next one here is this is actually a closed case, but I bring it up because I find it interesting. There's a young boy that was found dead on Wheelback Mountain. He was staying with his family near Loon Mountain at Clearbrook Condos. Very familiar with this place. I got a friend that has a house there, or a condo there. He was playing with his brother. He separated, a stepbrother, separated from the stepbrother, and a search was initiated. I think it took like 2-3 days worth of search. They finally found him decently high up on Wheelback Mountain. Cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Part of the family is still skeptical that he would have hiked up the elevation that he was found, and part of the family feels that there's more to this story than what is being told by the step family. So it's kind of a difficult family situation there. So I don't know if there was foul play or whatnot, but they've closed the case. But I think they've left the door open to say if there's new evidence, they would look at it. And then lastly, there's Maura Murray. We've talked about her a lot on the podcast, missing UMass student involved in a single car accident in Haverhill, New Hampshire. Was checked on by a local neighbor and then had disappeared within probably about 10 minutes of the police coming. This is one of the most well-known and researched missing person cases in the world. My personal theory on this is that I do think that she exited the scene. She was drinking. I think she made her way either east or west, likely made her way into the woods, into private property, and died of hypothermia somewhere, and just has not been found. I mean, that's my theory. Other people feel like there's foul play involved and things like that. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if that case ever gets cracked. And then missing persons and noteworthy criminal cases. So Kevin Race is a businessman from Maine. He was in a embezzlement lawsuit, or an embezzlement criminal case related to his company that he co-founded. He had a falling out with his partner, and he was facing some legal challenges. He was last seen alive on September 9th when he left a note at his home saying that he went to New Hampshire looking for his final resting place. He's a very strong outdoorsman and a hiker. Family members say that they believe he committed suicide at Mount Washington. Body's never been found, and authorities theorize that he may have staged his death to evade criminal charges. So he's either somewhere up on Mount Washington, or maybe he's in Mexico on a beach somewhere. Stefan Porsu is a young man from Dracut, or Lowell, I believe, that was reported missing in 2019. He was last seen on, he was reported to be seen on the Mount Washington Auto Road. His car was found in Pinkham Notch. He was a novice hiker, had no experience in winter hiking. He did have a receipt in his car where he had indicated that he had purchased some hiking gear. And there was some confusion in this case. His cell phone had pinged in Westford, Mass, in between the time that he was supposed to be seen on Mount Washington and when his car was discovered. There's been further developments in this case. I haven't really got into it too much in the podcast, but there's certainly a contingent of people in the Lowell area that feel that there's foul play involved in this, and that this young man was actually killed in and around where he lives, and that the car was brought up to Pinkham Notch, and that the hiking story was fabricated to as a diversion. I can tell you that he has family members that are former law enforcement in the Lowell area, so it's an interesting case that I'd love to see people get a little bit more focus on. I suspect that it's very unlikely that he actually ever made it onto Mount Washington. And I don't know the background on how people thought that he might have been seen near the auto road in the winter, but my suspicion is that this was likely foul play down in the Massachusetts area. But with the connection to Pinkham Notch and his car being there, it's possible maybe he is on the mountain. Another case from 1983, Michael Miller. So Michael was hiking with two friends in out of the Falling Waters, Old Bridle, Lafayette parking lot. They got there later in the day in October. Michael was carrying with him a 35 millimeter camera, and his plan was to hike up to Franconia Ridge to take some pictures. None of the three people that were hiking, Michael or his two companions, had any experience whatsoever. They went up the Old Bridle Trail. When you go on the Old Bridle Trail, you get about a half a mile in, and there's a 90-degree turn there. If you stop and look up, you'll see the Agonies up there, and it's open forest from that section. There was an article on Appalachia from summer of 1984 that described the rescue in detail, and we actually did a show segment on it. My theory, so the hiking partners indicated that that's where Michael went off trail, and he said, "I'm going to go in this way. I'm going to go directly to the mountain, and then I'll meet you up there." So I think Michael thought that the Agonies were actually the top of the mountain, so he went off trail, took a direct beeline towards the Agonies. I'm assuming as he got up into those steep cliffs, he probably made his way to the left towards Greenleaf, and then from there he was never seen again. There was a canine hit up near the Agonies that indicated that he might have gone over the other side of the trail to Lafayette Brook. He had no light. He was wearing a leather jacket. He was wearing like work boots, jeans. He had a 35 millimeter camera. It initiated a 7-day search in 1983 that involved Civil Air Patrol, hundreds of volunteers. But the night he went missing was the first major snowstorm of the year. Temperatures dropped down significantly, and the chances of him surviving are zero. His body's just never been found. He did bring with him a 35 millimeter camera. I posted about this story on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit on Reddit, and I did a summary of the summer 1984 Appalachia article. Michael's sister actually reached out to me and told me that she never knew any of the background of the story, and she thanked me for bringing it to light. And she was the one that told me that he did have that 35 millimeter camera, and she thinks that if anything survived, it would have been that. So if anybody ever wanted to go out there with a metal detector and poke around, who knows what you might find, but it would literally be like a needle in a haystack. These last two cases are criminal cases. So Todd Spain is a youth pastor from Pelham, New Hampshire. In 2019, he took his wife for a hike on the Boulder Loop, took her to the outlook of the Boulder Loop, and then attempted to push her off a ledge, and then proceeded to attack her with a rock. Given the way the justice system is, Todd was able to plead down in his case, and he ended up serving 30 days in jail. The wife didn't want to go through a court proceeding and just wanted to move on with her life. So, this guy, I always say, remember his name, because he'll be in the news again for another violent crime, no doubt about it. And then we always talk about car vandalism. Anna Labraney and Jonathan Richardson were arrested in 2019 for a series of car break-ins and vandalism for cars that were parked in trailheads along the Kink. So just to put a name to that crime, because it does pop up quite a bit. And I believe they were in Manchester or somewhere down south, so they were driving up a fair distance to get to those parking lots. But that concludes my presentation. So I hope I didn't bore anybody to death. And I hope you found this interesting. And if anybody has any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Hey, thank you so much. This was really informative. I really appreciate the work that was put into this.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, and it's fun. It's a sort of a passion project for me, and it's interesting. And we use it for the podcast a little bit, and it's just good to have data to be able to answer some questions. Like, you'll see, one of the reasons why I started doing this was you'd see on social media, rescues are out of control now. Like, are they really out of control, or did we just happen to have a cluster of 3 in a weekend, and then it just normalizes back again? So for me, rescues are never good. You never want to have a situation where they're happening, but they're not out of control, and the other thing is Massachusetts people are way more apt to get into, situations than New Hampshire locals or whatever. Yeah, that's kind of true, but it's not as bad as we think it is. So those were sort of the things that I wanted to answer, those questions, and then it morphed into this.
Great job, Mike. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invite, Lynn.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that everybody could make it on tonight. I would like to very quickly just show everybody something that I have queued up here. And what this is somebody in the chat had asked about the sounds like a search and rescue information. So if you're interested in taking a peek at the podcast that Mike and Stomp run, you can go to slasrpodcast.com. They also have a platform on, a page on a platform called Buy Me a Coffee. So if you're interested in supporting the Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast and or Mike's presentation tonight, please go on to Buy Me a Coffee and you can search Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast. So I've put a couple things in the chat here. The second thing I want to show you real quick is the Virgin Outdoor Hiking Buddies merchandise. So as I said, 20% of all sales from the Virgin Outdoor Hiking Buddies merch goes right to Hiking Buddies, and you can get either the hoodie or you can get the Flume base layer. So go online, or you can go to Lincoln to their store and check them out. You can actually see a lot of their products being made right in-house. And the last thing I have is just to take a look at the Hiking Buddies website. If you're interested in learning more about the classes that we offer through Redline Guiding, we do sponsor students ages 17 to 25, excuse me, young people. You don't have to be a student, but we will sponsor the gear and the cost of the class if you're 17 to 25. Adults are at a very generously discounted rate. Thank you very much for that, Mike. And so you can see that we offer 3-season and winter as that goes. So go ahead and take a look on hikingbuddies.org, please, whenever you get a chance. We do approximately monthly events like this where we're offering some kind of educational series. And Julie, I guess, do you have anything you'd like to add, or does anyone have remarks?
I have not much to add. Thank you very much, Mike. The presentation was fantastic, very eye-opening. You always have questions around this information, and it was it makes you question it more, and you just kind of want to dive into it. Appreciate you being here, Lynn. You did a great job. Nice job, and looking forward to see our buddies on our next event.
You bet. All right. Thanks again, Mike. We really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for being here. Have happy and safe trails.
Thank you for the
Happy
talk, guys.
hiking.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.